do dia. Agradeço a presença de todos e todas. Hoje, o professor Eduardo Wolf, professor de Filosofia Antiga da Universidade de Brasília, doutorado na USP. Professor Eduardo é pesquisador da Cátedra Arcaio de Brasília e é editor da revista Arcaio. Professor Eduardo Wolf, agradeço a presença dos professores Lucas Angione, professor Klaus Cursilhos. Passo a palavra ao professor Eduardo.
Obrigado por isso, Rubens. Obrigado a todos pela presença, mais do que a todos, especialmente ao Rubens e ao Fernando pelo convite, e obviamente fico muito honrado de poder aprender bastante aqui essa semana e, sobretudo, compartilhar aqui algumas ideias com vocês. Originally, I wrote a piece in English, just some sketch, because I wasn't sure how it would work, but we can go both ways. We can read it and maybe discuss it in Portuguese, since Klaus has a better Portuguese than most of us. Yes, of course. So I'll go as I planned. Okay. So thank you so much for this. I'm going to start with just some very preliminary remarks. The first one is this: I offered Fernando a brief description of what I was trying to do here. And I said to him that it would be some sort of contrast between propositions in moral philosophy, in contrast precisely with what we take to be practical truth. So these other kinds of propositions, right? So this is obviously a supposition. I have to try to explain in what sense I'm taking these two species, these two sorts of propositions to be meaningful in the Aristotelian context. But I think that if we look carefully at this first section, probably it will be quite evident for us what I have in mind, right? So I'll start with this, not focusing on practical truth. So I am here just to learn about practical truth during the workshop, but I will use some of the passages that you already know from our previous encounter yesterday, and I'll try to build upon these passages, okay? So the first section, which introduces this notion of practical reasoning and practical truth in order for me to proceed with the contrast I'm interested in. It starts with the T1, text 1 in my handout, which is precisely the passage that Professor Cursilhos examined yesterday. So I will not be examining in any detail. I will just remind you all that in our previous discussion, Professor Cursilhos showed us. Desculpa, Fernando pediu para avisar também que nós temos o QR Code ali para quem eventualmente quiser usar. So Professor Cursilhos showed us that we have here an analogy between the intellectual or theoretical aspect of rationality and the practical and productive aspects of rationality. So we examined this analogy yesterday, and I was just trying to extract from this short piece not exactly a piece of philosophical reflection, but a sort of typical kinds of examples of practical reasoning that would fit this description, right? So the first one in T1.1 is a famous passage already quoted on De Monte Animalium, and it goes like this: I need a covering, a cloak is a covering, I need a cloak. What I need, I should make. I need a cloak. I should make a cloak. And the conclusion, the I should make a cloak is an action. And he acts from a starting point. Okay? So this is not a piece of moral reasoning, something that I mentioned yesterday while we were discussing with Professor Cornelius. It's a typical example of a practical reasoning, no problem, but no one would consider this a ethical, a moral reasoning. I'm not using moral in the same, exactly the same sense Professor Cornelius mentioned yesterday, in which it had this modern connotation, right? So for now, let's take it as a neutral term for ethical, okay? But the second piece of example, T1.2, probably it's more related to what we take to be ethical or moral propositions, right? So in moral reasoning. If, for instance, anything sweet must be tasted, and this someone particular thing is sweet, it is necessary for someone who is able and unhindered also to act on this at the same time. This is a passage in Nicomachean Ethics 7, chapter 3. And once again, I'm not actually saying that this is a typical form of moral reasoning, but it clearly is more to this domain than the first one, okay? It would have to involve something like, the notions of temperance or something like that in order to consider it properly as a piece of moral reasoning. What I want to stress here is that those two pieces and other similar pieces like this, and we can see how Aristotle uses technical examples from the arts, the techniques, such as practice, such as medicine, the doctor, such as navigator or something like that, to illustrate what he's trying to make, both in book 3 and in book 6 and 7. So these are situations in which we, as the readers, we are at the same level. We are considering the exact same level at the agent who is doing the thinking. This is the point. We're trying to grasp what happens when some individual agent is going through the process of what we call moral reasoning, right? So every discussion about practical truth and most discussions on practical knowledge deal with these kinds of reasoning and with the conclusions and the premises such as these that I presented to you here, in terms of what the agent is undergoing in his mental and emotional process combined, okay? Now, the sort of contrast that I want to offer you here, and it's quite tentative, it's not something that I'm pretty sure how to go on all the details, but I think there's something here, is this. Now, how should we consider other kinds of reasoning and other kinds of arguments and other kinds of ethical truths, of propositions within the Aristotelian framework of what it is and what is a moral philosophy that does not fit this sort of practical reasoning, right? So the example I have here is the most famous one probably from book 1, and it is a piece of the ergon argument combined with the conclusion that offers us the definition of eudaimonia in book 1, okay? So we can read it quite quickly here. It's not the point, it's just to get things going. Let's consider how it operates. As I mentioned in the first quotation, this is Ross translation without modifications. So in the Revised Oxford, let us exclude, therefore, the life of nutrition and growth. What are we excluding here? We're considering what kind of function, what kind of life it actually is proper to man. So let's exclude the life of nutrition and growth, because they're not what we are interested in. They're proper for plants, etc. Next, there would be a life of perception, but this life also seems to be common even to the horse, the ox, and every animal. There remains then an active life of the element that has a rational principle. Of this, one part has such a principle in the sense of being obedient to one, the other in the sense of possessing one and exercising thought. And as these two can be taken in two ways, we must state that life in this sense of activity is what we mean, for this seems to be the more proper sense of the term. You obviously will be reminded that this has a different sort of presentation in chapter 13, but it's basically the same conceptual framework, right? And this is how Aristotle is building the conclusion that such and such will be the life proper for a man as a species, okay? And then he goes on to say, now, if the function of man is this conclusion that I just arrived at, if the function of man is an activity of soul in accordance with or not without rational principle, and we say a so-and-so and a good so-and-so have a function which is the same in kind, for instance, a lyre player and a good lyre player, and so without qualification in all cases, eminence in respect of excellence being added to the function. If this is the case, and we state, this is some lines that are not exactly the same lines in every edition, right? So, and we state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions of the soul implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of this. And if any action is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, if this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of soul in conformity with excellence. And if there are more than one excellence in conformity with the best and most complete. Okay? This is probably the most known passage from Book 1, the definition of eudaimonia, etc. Now, why am I bringing this sort of basic definition of one might say, a principle, maybe a first principle in the ethics, something that we always start with when we are reading Nicomachean Ethics? Why am I starting with this? Why am I bringing this passage in particular here? I could offer you different sorts of similar strategies of presentation of conclusions and definitions and arguments. The definition of virtue, of moral virtue, the definition of each one of the particular virtues, the definition of prohydices, we discussed a little bit yesterday. My point would be the same for all those concepts and for all those reasonings occurring in the treatise, i.e., this is not a piece of moral reasoning or of practical reasoning occurring for the agent. This is not how the agent is thinking at any time when he's proceeding to act, when he's trying to make a decision, when he's trying to choose, right? Then you say probably, well, this is quite obvious, but my point is that this sort of reasoning it's supposed to be not only a formal, very general, maybe empty content in terms of moral philosophy and practical philosophy, right? So if it's not just a very general, very formal, maybe empty case of theoretical reasoning, we can call it the way we want, what is it anyway? How can we understand, how should we understand the relation between these sort of philosophical arguments throughout the treatise and practical reasoning, moral reasoning within practical reasoning, and practical truth. What is the difference, in other terms, in other words, what is the difference between taking the definition of eudaimonia, the definition of the supreme good for man, such as this one, as being truth, and truth in terms of the conclusion of a syllogism, a practical syllogism? This is what I'm trying to explore, okay? Now, in order for me to try to identify the problem and just maybe defend myself against the obvious accusation that this is just missing the point, you're just looking to a different thing, you are just considering another aspect of moral philosophy or Aristotle's philosophy, you are missing the point. So in order for me to defend myself of this, let me just try to show you that most commentators, most interpreters of practical truth, of practical syllogism, of practical knowledge in Aristotle, they also mixed up some of these levels that I'm trying to show you here at the beginning, okay? So the first passage at this second section, T3 in the second page, this first passage appears right at the beginning of the French commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics by René Gautier Joliffe, in fact, right? He just stated that should have Aristotle given a title to its work, it would probably be something like Cours de Sciences Morales, Cours de Morale, lectures on morality, something like this, right? Okay? And then it says the following: Ce fait est d'une importance capitale. This fact is precisely that this is a lecture, a course, a series of courses on morality, okay? Il constitue l'acte de naissance de la science morale. It constitutes the birth certificate of moral science. On a objecté, il est vrai, qu'Aristote n'emploie jamais absolument l'expression réétiquée. So, people have argued against this, that Aristotle never uses the expression réétiquée, the ethical science, or something like this, la science morale. Mais dans la séquence analytique, livre 1, chapitre 33, il emploie dans son texte qui se réfère au livre 6 de l'éthique à Eudème, c'est-à-dire la version eudémienne du livre 6 de l'éthique à Nicomaque, l'expression éthique theoria. So Aristotle uses ethical theory, and theoria should be taken here, maybe, in terms of something more robust than a general notion of study, but something a little more robust in terms of a theoretical way of approaching ethics, okay? Et ils sont hors de doute que l'expression désigne bien la science morale, moral science. The expression would fit precisely this. Car elle est employée conjointement avec celle de physique, physique théoria, qui ne peut désigner que la science physique, le mot de science, étant bien entendu, et aí paramos aqui, stop short, just at this point, up to this point, we're reading someone telling us this is a moral science, this is a theoretical reflection on morals, on ethical, on the ethical domain, okay? But then the last line of this passage, it says, le mot de science étant bien entendu pris en sens le plus large. À parler strictement, la morale pour Aristote n'est pas science, mais sagesse. So, by the end, he says, no, but this is not what Aristotle is doing. Because in its strictest sense, for Aristotle, there's no science of the ethical domain. There's just phronesis. And this is a different thing. But he is mixing up things from the beginning and throughout the commentary, which is, as you probably know, very long, very detailed, and maybe Lucas would say very wrong. Not only very long, but with lots of passages in which it can be saying this. Okay, so this is during the late 1950s, right? It's not the main topic of the commentary, of course not, but it seems to me that it is relevant that as general interpreters were looking at Nicomachean ethics as a whole, this superposition, this contrast that I'm trying to insinuate to you that it is there, it is in the text, is something that they themselves were not really clear about. And I can show passages in Ross's book in 1923 that it's similar to this, okay? With a Kantian and not a very Catholic approach, but similar to this, okay? Now, this is not a very strong version for me. It's just a very general remark. But I think we have, in the 1980s, a stronger version of the same confusion about this tension of these two sorts of reasonings occurring within moral or ethical philosophy, and we don't know how to tell them apart quite clearly. This is a passage from Barnes' introduction to a very popular translation during the 1980s by Thompson, and he says the following, T4. Any work of moral philosophy is liable to contain judgments of two different sorts. It will contain, on the one hand, substantive moral judgments to the effect that certain men or types of men, or actions or types of action, etc., are good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous or vicious, obligatory or impermissible, and so on. In short, it will offer opinion and advice on moral matters. A simple example from the beginning of the Ethics is Aristotle's recommendation that young men should not study political science. I know by myself, by experience. Okay, so this is a very neutral description. There are some propositions, it seems to be a very neutral decision. Sorry, it's not, but it seems to be a very neutral description. So there are some propositions within a moral treatise that are more substantive because they're dealing with telling you types of actions or people or characters that are right or wrong or bad or good, etc., etc. And then he goes on to say, on the other hand, a work of moral philosophy will contain judgments about such substantive moral judgments to the fact that they are or not factual or objective or prescriptive, etc. Instead of etc., I could say true. Okay? Sort of the same as to say that they are the case or they are factual or they are objective. Okay? That the concepts they use, the philosophers, okay, and these moral books, moral treatises, moral theories, okay, they use the concepts they use are to be elucidated in such and such a way that they are logically interrelated in such a manner, and so on. Let me give you just an example, and it will be just a reminiscence of yesterday, okay? When Professor Corsidius was just starting his presentation and offering you a general context of the Nicomachean Ethics, he showed us that we start with this general thesis that, well, Aristotle has this philosophia, this philosophy about the human affairs, the human things, the Doctrina Philosophia, and then goes on to show us this investigation starts with the most basic question about what is the human good, what is the good for man. And it goes on to show us that this has a certain name, eudaimonia, happiness, whatever, and that some other concepts are connected to the definition offered of eudaimonia, such as virtue, but virtue is connected with our capacities in two ways, intellectual virtue and moral virtue, and so on and so on and so on, up to the point that he was presenting us practical reason, book 6, right? So this is a logically connected and interrelated way to show how those concepts relate themselves, are related between themselves, and how they exhibit in a way what it is to investigate and to try to know what it is good for man, what it is eudaimonia, etc., etc. Okay? This would fit Barnes' description here. And then he goes on to say, well, it will contain, in short, adversions on what is sometimes called the logic of moral discourse. I take logic to be not just this internal connections, but generally formal and conceptual structure of the moral discourse, okay? A simple example from the beginning of the Ethics is Aristotle's suggestion about, and this is my point, the meaning of the term good, precisely at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, okay? So, how would you describe these two domains Barnes is describing? Well, he uses the word, so we can use it, maybe. I can use it, maybe. Ethical and meta-ethical. But this is not Aristotle. Aristotle does not use this distinction. So this is not something that we are actually taking from the text and saying, okay, he clearly states that he's operating with two different levels within the treatise. This is something that apparently Barnes convinced us, for the moment at least, that this is something that is happening in the text, okay? Now, there are some very interesting and maybe some dreadful conclusions to extract if we accept this distinction. One of them is that we consider at first to be the most basic and the most important question, what is good for man, and what is eudaimonia, is merely a meta-ethical question. It's merely a, let's call it like this, a second-order proposition about how we live our lives well, okay? But it's not in itself ethical. It does not have ethical content. And this is quite striking because, as you obviously remember, Aristotle tells us right at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics that try to know what this supreme good, this good that is not only the good, but the best one, is something really important for our lives. And we should aim at it. But if it's just a meta-ethical proposition, it's kind of strange to say something like this, right? But there's a second, even more complicated and more dreadful conclusion that Barnes himself tries to show to us. This is T4.1. And he says this, in his introductory remarks on method in 1.3, so he's not being scientific, he's using by what? Yes, of course, right? He's not using the German Beckett and by water edition. So I'm sorry. So in his introductory remarks on method in 1.3, Aristotle asserts quite generally of his statements in the Ethics that they are to be taken implicitly as Josepito for the most part. There are propositions for the most part. Fernando is having a class, but this is John Barnes, and he goes on to say, in other words, the non-universality thesis. So there are no universal propositions. There are no universal truths in ethics, and this is something that we know Aristotle says, not exactly in these terms, but this is what he is saying at the beginning in the methodological passage. We can discuss this and debate this later. So the non-universality thesis is alleged to hold for all the matter in the ethics. Not only for situations such as, this is sweet, I should not eat sweet, so I will not eat it. It's not only for these clearly agent context situations in which I am actually at the same level, sort of at the same level of the practical agent, but the whole content would not be precise, would not be rigorous, would not be universal, okay? And then Barnes goes on to say, and thus, in particular, for the great quantity of meta-ethical judgments which it contains. And this is quite strange, because in what way a definition or a philosophical elucidation of the term good would not be precise or universal or whatever, or the definition of moral virtue or of courage, whatever. This is not quite clear. And maybe the reason is precisely this. Aristotle is not trying to present just an explanation, just a elucidation of what the term good is. And he does not think that those considerations, those restraints in terms of universality, in terms of rigorous thinking, etc., apply to the most basic conceptual framework of his treatise. Maybe it's true that you will not be able to hold universal propositions about what to do here and now every single moment of your life. Okay, but this is not to say that you cannot hold such a proposition, such as moral character is such and such a thing. And this would be universally truth and valid and correct. Maybe this is one of the problems. Barnes is sensible to this, and he continues, and I am this quote with this last line, but Aristotle's argument supports at most the view that there are no true universal ethical judgments. And that view does not imply that there are no true universal meta-ethical ones. Okay, it seems to have established the point. This sort of inconsistency in the instability and this sort of variability applies to the domain of the agent, and those propositions I'm trying to describe here as ethical, not meta-ethical, in terms of Barnes' description, okay? He abandoned this later, but I think it's interesting to see how he was stumbled on this stuff. But not for the theoretical ones, okay? The point is that in what sense Barnes would accept that some of those meta-ethical and maybe even the ethical propositions, such as, well, it is right to honor your father and your mother, etc., honor your family. Well, maybe you can say this is an ethical proposition, not a meta-ethical one. It's a substantive one and not a general formal one, and universally valid. But then Barnes says this, T.4.2, about semantical and meta-ethical judgments. In a sense, they say nothing. They are tautologies or analytic judgments. Their subject terms already include the notion of goodness or badness. And this applies both to the ethical and the meta-ethical. Because when I explain successfully to you what the term good is, what the term virtue is, what the term whatever is, this is in a way a definition, let's call it like this, neutral use of definition here. At least it's a conceptual explanation of what that term is, and there's no difference in terms of what is in only one side and on the other side of the equation, right? So to be good is to be such and such. This is a very broad way to say it. This is analytical. There's no information here, right? And this is valid also for some ethical truths. And this example, I will not be focusing on this one, but this example in 1179. There's no O, there's no zero. 1179 is where Aristotle is mentioned, probably read this yesterday. Those cases of murder, and he tries to explain this in terms of this is something bad, and even the name says that it is bad in itself, and there's no other way to consider it. Adultery, murder, etc., etc. Okay, 3 cases now. It comes from the name. Even to say this is to establish the fact that this is a bad thing. Okay. Well, what is the result up to now? What is the result up to now? We have 2 pieces. The first pieces, I'm trying to go very slowly with this because, as I said, I'm not pretty sure of everything here. But it's not that obvious as it seemed when I was just starting this talk with you, that these 2 sorts of propositions and 2 sorts of reasoning are so far apart, and they have nothing to do with each other, that I was so clearly missing the point in bringing up examples of arguments that reach to definitions or to more conceptual clarifications. So there are some good reasons to consider that these 2 levels are in fact operated in the text, and that some people got either confused or excessively confident in how to classify them and solve the problem. Case 1 and case 2 being quotation in Dorothy Mars. Okay. Now, is there any evidence that we can apport to this discussion? Is there any textual evidence, some passages in the Nicomachean Ethics, in which I could show you not only these stretch-forward examples, okay, practical reasoning, giving an example in the Monte Animale or book 6 or book 7, and then the definition of eudaimonia. No. Show me something a little bit closer, a little bit more substantive, more relevant, okay? And I think that in section 4, some textual basis for this classical tension, we can see this. Obviously, this is connected with other kinds of discussions in Aristotle, such as the nature of its method of investigation, the nature of its ethical theory being a particularist one or not, but I'll not be focusing on this, okay? So text 5, T5 says this. Since then, the present is, this is Nicomachean Ethics, book 2, chapter 2, okay? Since then, the present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge. It's ut theorias gene. It's not about knowing things in the theoretical way. And this is not a general employment of theoria, such as just to study something. Study as in regard of these sorts of objects that are appropriate to theorein, contemplate, intellectually know something, okay? Since this present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge like the others, for we are inquiring, not in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, since otherwise our inquiry would have been of no use. We must examine the nature of actions, namely how we ought to do them. For these determine also the nature of the states that are produced, as we have said. So what is the contrast now? It's a little bit different from the one that I started with, right? The contrast now is between knowing theoretically something, and this depends on some sort of properties from of these objects that are knowable, okay, and some other sort of inquiry, some other sort of investigation that has other objects, and these other objects have they have other properties, right? So this is sort of the scheme. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, I'm not going through the typical analysis of practical truth, etc., etc. But you can see from the way I'm trying to bring this up for us now, that this runs parallel to what Klaus was mentioned yesterday about objects of knowledge and ways of those two forms of rationality operating, and the two parallel descriptions we have from knowing as is P theoretically and as is good doing S, etc., etc. Okay, this runs parallel. Okay, but the main point here is that there's something that obviously guides us to the distinction between these two things. And I think that this piece from book 6, T 5.168, right? So Kinetics 6.8 shows us this quite clearly. So the distinction is clearly when I contrast these two passages. And the passage says the following: that practical wisdom is not knowledge is evident, for it is, as has been said, concerned with the ultimate particular fact. So that practical wisdom is not knowledge, is that practical wisdom is not episteme, right? That phronesis is not episteme. This is evident, as I said, etc. Concerned with the, since for it is concerned with the ultimate particular fact. Since the thing to be done is of this nature, the thing to be done, not the thing to be known, right? It is opposed then to understanding, comprehension, whatever you want to translate it, okay? For comprehension is of the definitions for which no reason can be given, while practical wisdom, while phronesis, sagesse, prudencia, whatever, concerned with the ultimate particular, which is the object not of knowledge, but of perception, etc., etc. Right? So these two passages are clearly offering us a nuanced version of the general contrast I was starting with. Okay? Why? What exactly is the nuance I think we have here? What is the new element that we have here? Of course, there are some new informations, there are some clarifications. We have now this piece of information about objects of knowledge, defining proper ways of knowing things, etc., etc. Okay, but more than this, if we read carefully, we obviously notice that when in T5, Aristotle said that we are not inquiring in order to know what virtue is, T estime, he goes on to say that we should move to this other thing we're doing. We're inquiring this other thing, how to act well and be good individuals, be good agents, good moral agents. And it says that we must examine the nature of actions and all those stuff. So it seems that right from the start, within the first passage, Colóquio Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 2, within the first passage, we are already trapped in the same sort of tension I'm trying to show that from the beginning I'm offering you here as a picture, general picture of the philosophical problem here, right? Why? Because I don't investigate, I don't inquire into the nature of what is an action, what is intention, what is to act voluntary, in order to act voluntary or in order to just act. I don't have to follow a complex theoretical line of thought in order to have a proper conception or definition of action in order to be good. So it seems that at the beginning, the text is pushing us to this problem, okay? And from T5.2, we have, and on point 2 and point 3, we have Another example of what I think is actually happening, okay? T5.2 says this: if then the virtues are neither passions nor faculties, all that remains is that they should be states, actions. Thus, we have stated, have affirmed, have said what virtue is. O que é virtude? We have defined virtue. We have said what virtue is in respect of its genus. But this is not precisely what he said. We should not be bothered to do precisely because this is not what this inquiry was about. So what is the status of these sort of propositions? To know what virtue is and to say that virtue is such and such, right? It's a disposition of such and such a kind, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Is it an ethical truth? Is it a practical truth? Because it pertains to the domain of action. So it's not metaphysical. It's not theology. It's not physics. So is it ethical? Should it be analyzed in terms of what practical truth is? So this is what I'm trying to say. Okay, and this is clear that from what Aristotle says in the passage that I just quoted here. Okay, now what is the scenario now? And I mentioned this, but once again, please interrupt me at any time, not to be excessively boring. Okay, what is the scenario now? The only thing I would like you to grant me, the only thing I would like you to grant me, is that it's not a very silly question. It's not a very dumb question to consider the possibility that Aristotle himself was not that aware about these two levels of moral discourse or ethical discourse within the treatise. It's not something that he is mastering the way he mastered and offered us clearly statements, insofar as he is clear, of what it is to have nous, what it is to have episteme, what it is to have, etc., etc. It's not that clear what is going on here, right? And that he himself, Aristotle himself, is slipping from one level to another and going back and forth. This would be the idea, just to get this. If you allow me this, I will be more than satisfied. You could say, well, I still don't see the connection. I still don't see the connection between the sort of investigation that you were offering, i.e., what is the nature of propositions that are either definitions within the ethics or conceptual clarifications within the ethics. I don't see, you could argue, I don't see how this connects with practical truth and practical knowledge, etc., etc. I'll try to go on now to two more difficult and more long blocks of my presentation. What I would try to do now is to show that there are two contemporary versions of strategies to tackle the problem of what it is practical truth, what it is practical knowledge, and in doing so, trying to offer a good answer to how the theoretical intellect, this sort of rationality is connected, it's in some way doing something with practical intellect, and in doing so, trying to bridge the gap between them, right? And both strategies do so by means of saying that you have to focus on how the agent reasons and how he acts. This is the point, okay? So I'm focusing on this in these two strategies. And neither of them has anything interesting to say, I think at least, about all the rest of the Nicomachean ethics and all the rest of the human ethics. The result being, if I'm not mistaken, that you have something like this. Okay, if this is a practical physics, if this is practical philosophy, what is really important is that you act well, become a virtuous person, become a good one, etc. Okay? And we do not have to bother with any sort of theoretical elements that could contaminate us. So let's just do things and act well, etc. Where is Aristotle doing his best in terms of explaining to us how this happens? Then one possible answer would be, well, you have the piece about deliberation, the piece about connected with voluntary, etc., deliberation, choice, right? And you have the explanation of practical reasoning itself and practical truth. So this will be the most important thing for me to understand how the intellect is connected with all the elements that I'm calling here in a blanket sense practical, just practical, as opposed to thought. Okay, so this will be the focus, and all the rest would be mathematics, and mathematics, as was said at the beginning, would not be that important, right? And if these are the results that these two contemporary versions actually offer us, then I think that we are in a very good shape. But I'm probably wrong the way I'm reading them. Okay, so I'm here to stand correct, to be corrected by you. So the first one, right? So it's David Charles, 2015. It's on the bibliography at the end, right? So David Charles, in an article titled Aristotle on Practical and Theoretical Knowledge, which is published precisely in a book which was titled is Bridging the Gap Between Aristotle's Science and Ethics. So it's interesting to see that this was their project, right? Lots of articles, very, very interesting. I do recommend the book. Okay, so what is Charles' strategy, and how could I sum this up before I try to offer my why I am a little bit resilient and reticent about one aspect, not everything, of course, not everything, one aspect, and this one particular aspect of his conclusions. So he starts with the same passage we already quoted here, Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Chapter 2, and other definitions of what is practical knowledge, what is practical truth, etc. And then he says, well, there are two classical interpretations about this, right? So two ways I can read this. And then he says, I'll just quote this small pieces, of course, I've tried to reconstruct here in a debate with you, but this is just a small, quick reconstruction of the article. So the first one would say this. One account suggests that when the practical intellect functions as it should, nous, or thought, or standing, grasps the truth about what is good, and this is the verb that is important, directs right desire. So what is at stake here? We have two elements operating and one result, okay? And these two elements, they are ordered in a certain way. And one is causal in relation to the other, okay? So this is why he says here that this is the intellectualist version of the story, right? It is intellectual precisely because it is practical intellect. There's no talk about theoretical intellect, etc. It's the practical intellect. When it functions as it should, nous, or thought, different element, but okay. Grasps the truth about what is good and directs right desire. So practical intellect combined with nous operating well and right desire. It's practical intellect that is causing right desire to be right desire and to produce what it will be produced afterwards. Okay? He goes on to say, for some, support of this, the relevant intellectual grasp on the good is based on reasoning. For others, supporters of this, it arises from intuition or something like that. However, all intellectualists agree that the basic starting point in Aristotle's account of excellent ethical action is a true judgment that something is good, where such judgment is defined independently of desire on whose basis one desires corrected. So the priority is given to reasoning, okay? And the idea is that you only have the good that will be performed afterwards, right? That form the excellent ethical action, precisely because reason operates in this way, okay? Desire would be right and would be correct precisely on basis of this reason. But there's a second version that he calls, David Schwartz called, desire-based version of the story. And this second story is like this. The second version takes desire to determine in some way or other what one intellectually grasps as good. For some, desire controls which goals the agent has. Intellect can work out the means to achieve what they desire. It may even allow them to see more clearly what they desire. However, what they find to be good is basically determined by their desires, defined independently of judgment about what is true, right? So in the first one, judgment defined independently of desire, and here, defined independently of judgment about what is true. This completes the general scheme in which the second one is caused by desire and not by instinct, right? So these are the two main versions. You see, there's no talking about theoretical knowledge of episteme or the theoretical model. It's the practical intellect in that division that we saw yesterday, okay? It's only practical intellect operating with desire, other elements in our sort of human beings that we are and the way we act, okay? Why is this interesting? This is interesting because in order to offer an possible answer to the question, how is theoretical knowledge connected with practical knowledge? I have to start with this clear-cut vision of what the practical knowledge is and what elements are involved in it. Theoretical knowledge is not here at all for now, okay? And what exactly is Charles' suggestion in terms of how he should operate here? Well, forget these two terms and two distinct fields that are composing our picture here. And it says in T6.3, my proposal is that we understand Aristotle's remarks on practical knowledge as strongly analogous, and obviously it's not analogous in Aristotelian terms of a proportion, right? A katanoologia. It's not this. Analogous is the way we use the word, right? So it is analogous with his account of theoretical knowledge. Now theoretical knowledge is in the picture. It was not, now it is. Chaucer is bringing in how theoretical knowledge would be present in these sorts of reasoning, okay? And then he says, well, although the type of states involved differ, Aristotle envisages, or so I shall argue, the good states of both practical and theoretical intellect as requiring a distinctive grasp within a body of knowledge of the relevant, correct principles and the ability to derive further conclusions on their basis. Now, what will be this picture? And obviously, I'm not going into the details. You have much better people to do this than me. But what would be this notion of a distinctive grasp that would provide us within the body of knowledge of the relevant, correct principles and the ability to derive further conclusions on their basis? Let's start with the theoretical model. What will be the description, a very concise description of what Aristotle has to say about this in the posterior analytics and the way theoretical knowledge is presented? Well, one way to put it quite concisely is this. You have to grasp the proper causal relation, and you have to grasp it in terms of the adequate explanation of the item or process or phenomenon, etc. And by doing so, you are dealing with first principles in one sense, or at least with principles in one sense, right? And you're dealing with the essence of the item that is being identified and explained. And this is why, precisely because you grasped the essential feature that is causal and is the proper way of explaining what that thing is, that you can, as he says here, obtain the ability to derive further conclusions on their basis. Having this, you can derive another conclusions because you grasp, obviously, the proper nature of the thing, okay? Now, what would be the picture, the conceptual picture that we would have if we try to use this in terms of practical knowledge now? This would be for the theoretical knowledge, but what he is saying here, there's a strong analogy, and this strong analogy operates like this. The same sort of thing, it's not the same thing, same sort of thing is happening in both pictures, right? So I'm grasping something that has some properties, and the way I grasp it, the way I do this, allows me to derive other conclusions, right? So this one case I offered you now as a very concise and brief explanation of the theoretical model would be a deductive way of reasoning, right? From this, I can derive these other things by deduction. And what I need to have from the beginning, once I grasp the correct stuff, is precisely these essential features, the essence or the definition that contains the essence, etc. Okay? Would there be something similar on the other hand? When I was first reading this, I was wondering, well, now probably there will be some hints in terms of saying that the definition of eudaimonia, or the definition of moral virtue, or the definition of justice, or some definition in the Nicomachean Ethics, will be playing this role. This was something that I was expecting when I read the text. And obviously, it's not what is offered in the article. It's not what he's doing. So it's an analogy, but it's not the same thing that is happening. What is happening on the other hand? Had the model been this one that I was expecting, but it's not in text, I would have not only an analogy, and maybe something even stronger, I would have a fantastic answer to my first question. What is the nature and what is the function of all those propositions in the ethics that are not those concerned with how I act here and now? I will have an answer to what do I do with information such as, well, eudaimonia is activity of the soul according to or based on virtue, etc., etc. I would have something to do with this. I would be able to deduce something like this. But obviously, he knows that this is not the case. Charles knows that this is not the case. So he goes on to offer the analogy in terms of, well, I don't have a deduction on the other end. I would have induction from particular cases in which, given the proper circumstances and the right state of the agent, if the agent actually was well educated and he has the right desires, etc., in every single situation, he will be able to go on by induction and grasp a correct conception of such a thing as what is eudaimonia, what is that good plan for a life as a whole, what is to live well the life of a human being. It would be the reverse process. Not the one that I was expected and someone could expect. Well, I have the definition and then I deduce some other things in practice. No, it's the other thing. I live, and in living in a certain way, I can form different sorts of concepts, and then I go on to have the correct grasp of what it is a good plan for my life, and for instance, not doing philosophy or doing philosophy, whatever. Okay? Now, what is the problem here? Apart from concentrating, the typical description of the practical intellect and desire and other non-rational elements, right? Practical intellect involves rationality, okay? It's one form of rationality. We discussed this earlier. So apart from combining these two things in just one complex, instead of having two things, I have just one complex thing. As he says here in T6.4, which I read now, in which he says, these remarks show what is distinctive about practical thinking as presented in the motto, and he's now doing the same thing for the ethics. It is a type of thinking essentially directed at finding out what is good. Finding out what is good to do so as to do it. It results unless embedded in an action having as its goal the doing of what is good. You see, the phrase is calculated to capture the idea that this comes in just one block. This type of thinking is, in its nature, desire involving, combined now here. And what distinguishes it from theoretical thinking is not that its conclusion is action. This is something that Anscombe says, and he quotes, nor that it is generally followed in rational creatures by a desire to act accordingly, as in human accounts in the spirit of a human explanation. It is rather a type of action-directed thinking, desiderative thinking, requiring a distinctive desire involving way of grasping the conclusion and the initial premise of the relevant practical syllogism. Right? There are tons of things to discuss here. This is clearly very controversial. I'm not here to contested in block in a hole and said it's all wrong, and I think it's really insightful and always makes me think. But my point here is a minor one, is to say that you had offered me a promise, and this promise was this. I don't know how to say this in English and in any other language. In Portuguese, I use it a lot to say, tem uma nota promissória, cheque que eu passei. Promissory note, okay, thank you so much. Oh, passei uma nota. I was under this impression, at least. So I was expecting something more robust in terms of how to connect theoretical and practical here. What I have in the end is totally in the way I was presenting right in the first moments of my presentation, completely focused only on the agent in its practical situation, and what it is, what is left of the theoretical element is just the analogy, okay? And then, what do I do with those propositions and those sort of conceptual elements that I was trying to offer you from the beginning, from the title of my talk, a sort of definition, a sort of explanation. What is the role of defining eudaimonia, etc., etc. Now, I think Charles is even weaker, não fraco, mal, quer dizer, than Barnes when he says this, T6.5. Since there can be non-practical thinking about the good, this claim, the one he's making at this point, is not one about the meaning of the term good, but about the nature of practical thinking. And there can be non-practical thinking about goodness of actions, for instance, in the remote past. Now, look at this example here. It's a minor thing, but since my purpose was to say, how can I try to understand the nature of those other propositions? Take a look at this. So one thing I can do when I'm not operating in the practical knowledge branch of the stuff, right? And I, even so, try to think about the good, eudaimonia, moral virtue, definitions of particular virtues, etc., is that I can apply these sorts of thinking to the past, to the remote past, because it does not involve actually acting upon this thinking, okay? But this is obviously completely irrelevant. It's no use. So it does not fit any possible interpretation of what is the use of investigation, these notions. If one of the things you can do is, well, we can think retrospectively, right? But at the beginning of the sentence, he's saying as well, there is non-practical thinking of the good, and this non-practical thinking of the good is exactly the same example Barnes gives us. It's to clarify the meaning of the term good. But to clarify the meaning of the term good is again useless. You do not use it as a starting point for anything, right? So what do you do with this? What is exactly the purpose of having the trouble of writing not one but two ethical treatises to assert, maybe three, to assert this, okay? And then I'll start to move to the end of my talk, and then we have 40 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever Fernando decides. The second version, this is 2015, right? They've shot 2015. This is really recent. And the second version I will present you is, I think, even more complicated. I'm not quite sure that I understood all the steps they took, but it's really, really insightful as Charles's model. But again, my first take is it can be this, but well, let's give it a go, okay? So this is a paper by Benjamin Morrison and Hendrik Lawrence from Princeton, and it appeared in Phronesis in 2019, and it's called, as you have it right there in the end, Aristotle's Empiricist Theory of Doxastic Knowledge. Now, the first part of the paper, I'm not be discussing this, the first part of the paper is a really interesting reconstruction of what it is to have a empiricist kind of knowledge in light of the medical treatises and some sort of technical, we would call, descriptions of what doctors will do. So they have Galen, they have other sources. It's a really very interesting piece, right? The only point they're trying to make is to grasp that model of thinking about things. And it's not new to compare actions and ethical situations with doctors or navigators, etc. But they're trying to extract a little more precisely what are the precise features of that kind of thinking, and say this would be the way to think about practical truth, practical knowledge, the kinds of knowledge Aristotle is offering us when he's doing his ethics. Okay, so this is why it's plainly in our domain. Okay. Then the first piece in T7 gives a very brief statement of how they are trying to present their case. And they say this: the simple version of the idea is that there are two types of facts in the world, each with two different ways of hanging together. Two different types of fact, right? And they combine in different ways. Right. So this is similar to our lecture yesterday, and probably we'll be discussing this throughout the week. So we are in a familiar terrain. There is the domain of necessary truths which hang together in deductive explanatory structures. And to have the best understanding possible of these truths, you have to figure out that deductive explanatory structure, and when you have epistemic, scientific knowledge of that domain. Okay, so you see that they start with some properties of the knowable, the object of what is known. Okay, you see that this is one way things operate. These things combine in terms of a deductive, very formal, very abstract model. And then when I have this, and all the connections are correct, I have scientific knowledge. Okay? And then they go on to say this: then there is a domain of contingent truths. And when you, which hang together in non-deductive explanatory structures. Well, someone might object at the beginning. What do you mean they hang together? Well, maybe this is pretty clear for someone who is studying the physics. Is it clear for someone who is studying the ethics? Do you think that the same would go to actions as the way you go for physics? And then he goes on, they go on to say, and to have the best understanding possible of those truths, practical truths, exactly this is what is being defined. You have to discern the non-deductive explanatory structure, right? And when you have the technique, or the prohairisms, the practical knowledge, sagesse, of that domain according to whether the domain is one of production or action. The domain of contingent truths is not structured by syllogistic connections, and so the task of understanding those truths and appreciating their connections to one another is not a matter of discerning syllogistic connections. Hence, we need a different account of knowledge to fit these truths, and this Aristotle provides. Hence, Aristotle provides two different epistemologies for the two different domains of truth. For the theoretical one, you have one epistemology, deductive, and you have the syllogistic form in the deductive, in the properly demonstrative way. And in the other one, you have this different sort of thing concerning contingent truths and it will yield a different epistemology. Okay, so this is their basic claim, right? Okay, well, the technicalities here are quite interesting. We can discuss this a little bit further, but I will need to jump to my main point. There is one that I have to say this. I actually want to see what Lucas has to say about, because they invoke posterior analytics 133 and the idea of knowing the same thing to difference scientifically and doxastically and different in a non-scientific way. But not my main point. What do they do there? What is happening when you take a different approach? From this passage, T7, it seems quite the same as Charles was presenting. But now, here's the twist. It's not a matter of mirroring the analogy of theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge and seeing deduction and induction. It's a matter of seeing in completely empirical way what the agent grasps in each situation, and in each situation this is what it is to do well and to achieve what is good, etc., etc. And this process does not involve in any way theoretical propositions, essential features, explanations of any kind that pertains to the other domain, the theoretical one. So one example would be this, their example. Suppose a doctor, you go to see a physician, right? And the physician sees you have a certain disease, a certain symptom that is typical of a certain disease. He has something very similar to a technique, and then this is quite enough for him to treat you well. But suppose this physician is not able to deduce not any one of his decisions from definitions, theoretical definitions, of what a human being is, or what the body is in certain situation, or what the disease actually is, or whatever. There's no definition, there's no grasp in any sort, in any sense of any essence of whatsoever, okay? Why are they suggesting this example? Because they want to stress something that I think we would agree that, okay, it would be good, it would be nice, it may be something interesting to have a doctor, a physician that also knows this theoretical stuff, but it's not relevant for what they're doing, which is treating me for this particular disease here. This is the model. We can see how intuitively this works, right? So suppose I'm saying to you, using an example for our specialist, that the only reason why you should learn a certain language, either your own, your grammar, etc., or foreign language, is to communicate and to understand people, or to go through your business daily. Okay. Well, why would you pay attention to certain technical lessons of grammar and to know why precisely that adjective is inflected in that sort of way in that particular circumstance? You don't need this. You can read it. You understand. You can communicate. So there's no need to know the reason why those definitions are more theoretical concepts. This is a knowledge. This is not exactly theory first, okay? But this is what they're doing here. So, and if this is the case, let's now exchange the physician, the doctor example, for the practical wise man, women, and ask ourselves, in their model, this practical individual has no grasp whatsoever, or does not need to have any grasp of any definition of the human good, or any definition of the human nature, some sort of philosophical anthropology, such as, well, since the basic and most proper human function is such and such, then, etc., etc. This individual does not have to possess this grasping, this intellectual grasping, right? And Aristotle is pretty clear about this. He goes on living his life. Okay. Now, what would be a model in which I could, they are offering this. They could, it could pretty much be the case that they say, oh, there's no reason why I would bother with that sort of theoretical propositions, those philosophical propositions that we find in the ethics. But they do, and this is striking. And they say, well, what will be the case if I consider this individual and he or she has this sort of knowledge? T7.1, they say, one obvious way in which the philosophical phronimos, what is the philosophical phronimos? This precise description I just offered you, the individual that has phronesis plus the philosophical concepts about human nature, human function, the definition of daimonia, etc. One obvious way in which the philosophical phronimos might be better off than the non-philosophical phronimos is that their epistemonicon, this part of the soul that deals with those sorts of objects that are necessary, etc., 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 is in a position to furnish their logisticon or doxasticon, same thing, with two propositions. For example, about the function, the ergon, and other aspects of the nature of man. So these are ethical truths, right? Not quite. They're ethical only in the sense that they pertain to a book, a treatise on ethics. Because in terms of what is practically relevant, let's see how it goes. This could feature in their deliberations. I could use, if I was such a man, if I was such a phronimos, cum philosophos, then I could use this, okay? They have an extra source whereby they could come to entertain propositions apt to feature in their deliberations. They do not have to rely on experience alone. The whole picture was to say, experience alone does all the job, okay? You can learn by experience that humans are social creatures, or you can be an Aristotelian biologist. This is the difference, right? And to end this passage, but this is not to say that the philosophical phronimos has more or better phronesis. And now my main point, nothing in Aristotle's text so far, as we can see, demand this, and then they say, on this view, philosophical scientific knowledge of ethically relevant truths, definition of human good, definition of a daimonia, etc., 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 is not only unnecessary for phronesis and unqualified human virtue. So it is unnecessary, but not only this. As we argued before, such knowledge incidentally possessed, completely contingent this situation, possessed by a philosophically minded prudent man, phronimos, does not even place its possessor at an epistemic advantage over another phronimos who lacks such knowledge, as far as phronesis goes. Now, let me just state this quite clearly. It's plainly obvious to me that Aristotle do say things in this direction, right? So he's not at any moment throughout book 6 arguing in any particular way in terms of connecting some sort of conceptual knowledge of second order or meta-ethical ethical truths for the phronimos. The phronimos has a grasp. He has a description of a sort of eye of the soul that captures what is relevant and salient in every single situation, etc., etc. So this is, I'm not arguing against this description as being Aristotelian. It's perfectly Aristotelian. The only point is this. The result is non-practical knowledge about the good, the virtues, etc., 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 are unnecessary and not advantageous. So why do I have this sort of knowledge? What is the use of this sort of knowledge? Why do I write books about this? Right? This is my conclusion. See, I don't see any way you could bridge this gap in terms of offering one model in which what pertains to this domain that Barnes described as meta-ethics, and they are describing here in terms of the Fronimus plus the philosophical guided Fronimus, and I at some point described as second order set of propositions about the human nature, human good, etc., etc. I don't think that there's one model in which you could fit this in the description of what is actually going on with the practical agent, right? So what you actually can do. Now I offered to end this presentation an expanded version of text 5, in which it appears complete. So it's Nicomachean Ethics, book 2, chapter 2, it's complete here. And I will focus only on in one minor point here. So we already know now that we must act in accordance to right reason, is a common principle, and must be assumed. It will be discussed later, both what it is and how it is related to the other virtues. So even while he's doing the explanation of what is practical truth, he's doing exactly what is described in terms of the second order or methods, okay? But this must be agreed upon beforehand, that the whole account of the actions must be given in outline. So another point about the generality, non-universality. Not precisely, as we said at the very beginning, that the accounts we demand must be in accordance with the subject matter. Matters concerned with action and questions of what is good for us have no fixity any more than matters of health. So in practical context, no fixity, no universality. The general account being of this nature, the account of particular cases is yet more lacking in exactness, for they do not fall under any art or set of precepts, but the agents themselves must in each case consider what is appropriate to the occasion, as happens also in the art of medicine or of navigation. And this is water for the, so this is something that is really good for the Morrison and Lawrence model, right? So it's the doctor, it's the navigator. Okay, but following line. But though our present account is of this nature, such as this, imprecise, cannot grasp in detail nor in universal validity, etc. We must give what help we can. And this idea of certain ophelia, this idea of utility and help, is coming from the moral philosopher. First time I'm using this. It's coming from the moral philosopher, reflecting and considering theoretically explanations and definitions of the basic concepts of a structured description of what a good life is for a man. And it's coming from this level to the other level. We must help that circumstance in particular, that agent that is in a particular circumstance to act. So you have to bridge this gap in some way. But I have no idea how to do this. I really don't have any idea. What I just try to say here is that I feel a little bit uncomfortable the way that we just do away with the sort of attitude we have towards this problem when we consider it. Because we say, okay, there are some elements here, but what you were discussing is this, you don't have to read the Nicomachean Ethics in order to be good. No, it's not this. This is obvious. I'm not arguing this. Oh, you are saying that there could be practical wise men previously to Aristotle. Of course this is true. This is not what I'm trying to understand is what is the role of these concepts, not for the philosopher, but for the practical agent, because this is not the only passage in which he says that we have to offer some help, that we have to be helpful, that something that we are investigating has to be helpful in practice, etc., etc. So there has to be a way to bridge this gap, right? So, what is it? I don't know, but I have some hints, and maybe we can discuss it. So this is what I had prepared for us. Now we have 40 minutes, 35 minutes. Thank you very much for your patience. Duly noted. Diga.
Você pode consolar.
Claro. Todas. Claro, quem quiser falar, fale. Só português, claro, qualquer língua. Quem quiser.
Posso fazer primeiro?
Claro.
Eu concordo com os problemas que você apontou. Isso bem. E me incomoda um pouco a leitura que é feita do seu texto 5. O Teorias Antiga, Filosofia Antiga, precisa ser entendido desse modo, como forte, como distinguindo dois campos distintos, o campo da ética, em que a teoria não existe, e o campo da teoria, que é atual, não existe. Teorias Antiga, que pode ser entendido não só essa tradução que você colocou é do Ross.
Sim.
Né? Que está aqui, since then the present environment does not aim at me parece que perde a orientação teleológica do estudo. Então, olha, nosso foco, dá para entender o texto assim, nosso foco não é teoria, mas acho que o grego pode ser entendido como nossa reflexão não é orientada pela teoria, mas pela ação. Nesse caso, teoria é importante. E aí, os quais podem ajudar nisso, né? Já tem mais grego que eu, Leandro ali atrás também. Mas como que a gente lesse o roster?
Sim, isso.
Como que a gente lê esse roster? Porque esse roster pode ser o seguinte, olha, a gente não está orientado pela teoria, teleologicamente guiado pela teoria, como as outras estão. Precisamente no modo como as outras estão.
Sim, você está sugerindo, então, uma leitura que seria, parafraseando, quase que adverbial. Né? Você está dizendo assim, bom, então, não está sendo afirmado que a questão não é de, não se trata de a nossa investigação não ser em vista dos objetos da contemplação, como as outras são, mas de ela não ser em vista da teoria, seja isso que queira dizer, vamos deixar como mais neutro agora, do modo como as outras são, é assim que você está sugerindo, né?
Então, você não exclui, a gente não está no domínio da discussão que eu entendo, do intelecto prático, etc. Está no domínio do que seria de metaética no termo
do Barnes.
É bom, mas ainda assim teria algum tipo de contato entre características específicas da disciplina, das disciplinas práticas, para a metaética. Senão a gente teria uma epistemologia que se aplicaria para todo mundo
Sim. Mas você não tenderia a achar que, pelos usos tanto em 6, como aqui é 6, quanto na metafísica, essas expressões de ser orientado para, né, serem vista da teoria, em algum sentido, né? Tendem a ser mais fortemente contrastantes com o outro campo, né? Que aí você teria que abrir fazer desse caso não diria uma exceção, mas seria uma versão bem mais frouxa de um termo que normalmente aparece mais marcado por contraste com o outro campo, das coisas que são vistas da produção, da ação.
Não sei, isso eu teria que ver. Isso aqui me passou quando eu estava na sua apresentação.
Tá. Não, eu te confesso que eu sempre li nesse sentido mais forte, de que era perfeitamente correlato aos outros casos de contrastes entre o que é teorias Hennig, né, e o que é em vista da produção, em vista da ação, do resultado, né, e que o contraste, portanto, não seria só do modo, mas seria no campo inteiro. Né? Mas eu acho que o que seria o resultado curioso? Diminuiria muito o problema, mas você teria possivelmente uma das únicas ocorrências, teria que fazer uma verificação mais detalhada, mas você teria uma das únicas ocorrências do testando como quer, para além da ética eudêmia que o próprio Gautier usa, de uma investigação ética que seria teoria, num certo sentido, mas num modo totalmente diferente, não no modo das outras, né? Esse seria mais para aquele modo, coisa. Então você puxaria um exemplo daquilo lá.
Né? Aí, modo seria essa versão expandida no seu último texto.
Uhum.
Então, a teoria vem algo no auxílio para
me agrada.
O contexto ajudaria a dar uso de discussão. Eu não tinha pensado, eu sempre li o texto com
essa visão mais forte, né? A intuição da gente na leitura é essa.
E eu acho que se essa leitura for viável, a gente tem uma razão muito boa também para excluir a leitura do
Lawrence.
Lawrence.
A principal que eu vi até agora, eu não trouxe aqui porque eu não me senti seguro de fato para abordar, mas a principal que eu vejo para recusar é o modo como eles leem o 33. Tá errado, né? Só queria que alguém mais autorizado que eu fizesse. Mas você tinha uma pergunta, Lucas, né? E depois você falou. Ótimo.
Também acho que a questão do Ross tecido presently by the non-name act são muito muito mecânica conjuntiva. Mecânica conjuntiva, que pode simplesmente estar querendo dizer, vai a linha, Fernando, mas acho que talvez seja diferente do que o Fernando estava dizendo, que a presente pragmateia não tem um fim último na teoria. Há um paralelo. Mas é diferente de você dizer assim, fim último disso é tal coisa, ou não é tal coisa, e você dizer, essa atividade não deve ou não mira para tal coisa. Se você pensar, você toma água agora, você visou ou tomar água, você pode dizer, matar minha sede, mas obviamente você visou matar a sua sede para continuar a palestra. Porque se você não tomar água, a sua garganta seca, 5, 6, você não continua a palestra. No fundo, o seu fim último, nesse caso, que é continuar a palestra, matar a sede para continuar a palestra. E você poderia dizer isso num contexto similar a esse, dizendo assim, eu tomar água não é simplesmente em vista do matar a sede, mas é em vista do continuar a palestra. Ele não está excluindo de que os fins subordinados são também desejados. As biólogas não são muito bem sutis, constitutivo. E tem que tomar cuidado. Essa tradução é um pouco estranha.
Sim, uma coisa mais fraca seria simplesmente, ela não tem propósito final, ela tem o último ponto de vista, o último termo de chegada da sua
ela não termina lá, que a completude dela, o acabamento final dela não é ali. Essa é a ideia. Ela não precisa de nada, o acabamento final dela não é teoria.
Sim. Eu não estou com a sua tradução aqui do livro 6, mas se você se lembrar de cabeça, o livro...
Talvez eu lembre.
Não, era só para ver se... Né, eu uso em aula, então demorar mais de apresentar para os alunos exatamente na sua tradução essa divisão da ciência do livro 6 e lia sempre em consonância com a passagem da metafísica e com essa passagem aqui. Mas aí você poderia tranquilamente dizer o seguinte, bom, lá, ainda que a expressão seja a mesma, é um contexto diferente, porque aí você tem claramente os objetos definidos, e aí os termos finais são esses mesmos, seus objetos têm aquelas propriedades, isso determina os campos de saber ali, tá? E aqui, como é uma observação mais de metodologia e de natureza desta investigação, você pode fazer um uso que é dessa versão de não é o seu propósito final, não é o seu último termo, não é o seu acabamento, não é o seu fim, nesse sentido. O que permitiria fazer uma leitura que dissesse assim, por que você termina um livro desse com, bom, então agora vamos para o que falta, que é a política, que é a investigação da legislação, etc. e tal. O complemento é a completude da filosofia das coisas humanas, como o Wolf introduziu ontem, né? Envolve agora essa segunda parte, depois do Tratado da Ética, do termo político. E isso significa que é para ir para ação mesmo. Seria, mais ou menos isso seria uma consequência de ler desse modo. Tá? Enfraquece bastante o problema, né? A romana, são as outras passagens, claro, mas isso seria um... Você vai nessa direção, Fernando? Você deveria ser... Não, eu gostei muito disso. Né? Aí tem que comparar só com as outras passagens.
E aí o parêntese passa a ser bastante interessante. Vamos saber o que é...
Sim. O Garino, ele falou assim,
o espectrômetro, né? Nós não temos isso como objetivo, mas não ter isso como objetivo não quer saber que isso não faz parte do percurso.
Sim.
Isso não é
o termo final, claro.
Exato. O fim último, ou como os alunos gostam de falar, fim final.
Fim final. Exato.
Da pragmatéria, da aula, sei lá, da investigação pragmatéria, mas que nos tornemos bons. Esse é o último.
Ainda que tudo isso possa estar no percurso, né? Tudo isso possa estar no percurso. Sim, muito bom.
Dentro desse texto, vocês também me encontram são orgulhosos dessa de barato, falando mesmo quem vai dando a entender que os dois espectrômetros, não só, o outro bem implicado, porque o espectrômetro
É um isso.
Literalmente, o nós, que é o mesmo nós para a matéria. Necessário, assim. Porque é uma observação paramétrica, você pode... Não estou dizendo que isso é uma interpretação que eu defendo nem nada, mas é possível você entender que o farmatéria está falando do peito da Aristóteles, que é o cara que ele está desenvolvendo, mas aí, parênteses, ele está dizendo o seguinte, olha, nós, como agentes morais, ou seja, o for, agentes práticos em geral, fazendo nossas investigações práticas, a gente acha que agora, não para conhecer o que é a virtude, mas para nos tornar bons. Entendeu o ponto? Ele está fazendo uma observação geral. Nós, como agentes práticos, em geral, fazemos as nossas investigações para nos tornarmos bons e saber o que é a Terra, não ter nenhum problema. Né? E fecha parênteses e volta para a matéria. Não necessariamente é o mesmo nós. Por exemplo, que são dois nós.
Sim.
Desconectados. Mas não precisa ser tão automático assim. Como na função do nós, dá muito isso de uma present inquiry, depois inquiry. mais complicado do que eu estou.
Sim, nessa versão, usando a versão do Ross, você teria essa sutileza de dizer, bom, perfeitamente possível dizer que a investigação opera num certo nível, e depois você tem um nós que é assim, a investigação, tal como ela nos interessa, né? Você faria uma coisa assim, agora estou colocando aqui o que é o ponto relevante para nós, efetivamente, e o primeiro seria simplesmente, bom, a investigação sem essa consideração a isso.
Eu não sei se eu fiz entender, acho que não.
Não, na verdade, o que eu não tenho compreendido.
Para os pragmateia, vão tratar
sim.
A questão dos filósofos,
Isso.
das coisas humanas. Parênteses, remarque, que eles estão dizendo assim, nós, em geral, não filósofos.
Sim.
Necessariamente.
Ah, entendi o contraste. Claro.
Em geral, não filósofos.
Sim.
Quando temos que agir.
Sim.
E qual o objetivo dos nossos investigadores?
Sim.
Que é a virtude. Investir para nos tornar bons. Não necessariamente para nos tornar bons. Ano que vem eu quero ser melhor, não sei o que hoje. Mas para que a minha ação internamente signifique.
Sim, perfeito.
Por isso. E daí, dado que uma ação aqui agora, com a gente que não é filósofo, eventualmente saber o que é a virtude, a definição dela, não teria nenhum óferos.
Exato.
Esse segundo parênteses. Esse nós que não é nós filósofos, mas o Parmateia, nós não isso. Nós somos filósofos.
Sim, você introjeta daí a distinção do filósofo moral e a situação dos agentes, as pessoas desconsiderando serem filósofos, tá? E isso combinado com aquela observação do Fernando e na sua leitura, se não elimina o problema da passagem, pelo menos arranja as coisas.
É algo que precisa ser considerado e rejeitado.
Sim.
Não simplesmente.
Claro.
A tradição nossa está dando isso de bandeja, se não houvesse uma possibilidade de leitura, que eu acho que dá mais.
Sim.
Promissor.
Não, excelente. Eu acho que sim. A dificuldade é ver se isso é consistente com as outras passagens em que essas coisas acontecem. Mas que essa daqui oferece uma boa rota de saída, parece bom. Parece bem promissor.
Eu estou com algumas coisas diferentes também, né? Primeiro, eu não traduziria pragmateia por
enquadro, sim.
Tratado, e isso não é difícil achar. Os tópicos começam assim.
Sim.
Não tem problema. Segundo lugar, mas aí não é um ponto importante da apresentação, we must examine the nature of actions. Mas o grego é mais entende.
Sim, então peritas praxeis, né? Sim. Acerca delas. Sim, você investigar as ações.
Importante como mas esse ponto já não é importante.
Claro. Não, mas é. Qual seria?
Yes, I have something to say about the reading of this passage. I forgot which it is. This teleological reading suggests like Fernando. I think it has to be also discussed by Lucas. It has to be read that way. It does not. These are not two disjunctive classes of things that are being considered by these two kinds of investigations. No, it's the statement that involves it. And that might very well include that both of them have theoretical content. Now, not in the ontological sense that we're dealing with mortal things or something like that, but it's not ruled out by the passage that there is a great deal of theory. I have to say something about this in a second. Now, you said that this might be the only occurrence of theoria that's, or it would be, perhaps an unparalleled use of theory. Well, theory is quite an innocent word. If you look at the rhetoric, which is a poetical thing,
right.
He says, what is rhetoric? Well, that's the art to tell their side, well, that's what you do when there's theory, even in craft.
In craft.
And so I really think that that is the meaning that we can safely apply to many of the statements, if not all of them, that we find in the ethics. I really like your paper because you show that there is this gap, okay? That if we apply this distinction completely alien to Aristotle between meta-ethics and practical,
Exactly.
then and we construe them in the way that you show that people construe them, then Aristotle is schizophrenic, and half of what he says in the ethics is useless. Right? Now we don't want to. Why should we follow such an interpretation? Only because these people have contracts with well-distributed children. That's not a good reason. So it really doesn't make sense. I really like that part of it. Now, if we just get rid of this rubbish, okay, and we read this in an innocent way, but what do we get? We get someone who thinks that it's important not only to know what's good for a human being, but also to act upon it. So there's a practical goal. Okay. Now we have a rough, fleshing out of what the human good is by the end of book 1 and the beginning of book 2. In 2.2, which is important, because I think is important for your argument to point out that there is a gap. Aristotle hammers in again. He does it time and again that in ethics or moral philosophy or Anthropina Filosofia is difficult because there is nothing fixed in practical matters. But we must help ourselves. This is how then when he introduces the knowledge to define the virtues and how to act well. Because we don't know what virtue is, so as to be able to act well, we need to identify good actions. But it's so hard to find anything stable in the practical domain. Yet we need to help ourselves. It is there that Aristotle comes up with the doctrine of the mean.
Right.
Well, the doctrine of the mean is a fairly general thing to say. It has some tautological elements in it, because the definition of the moral virtues includes reference to knowledge of what is good, includes reference to so on and so forth. Yet, it is something general, that harmless sense theoretical about virtue. And it tells us something more specifically than just do the right thing. Now, do the right thing specifically in this area means that you are doing not this, not that, but that, and so on and so forth. So that he's trying to help us, giving us the description of what it is to act well. Now, that is not the same project as the project of moral philosophy at all, where I talk about norms. He's talking about action. He's trying to desperately, as hard as he can, to explain to us what good actions are. And so he distributes them over different salient fields, which is
Right.
All of that is theory. It's not theoria, because we're not dealing with immutable things.
Right.
We're trying to approximate. But this is supposed to be the case, supposed to be something that we can accept quite generally about human virtues and human action. Whereas the characteristic of practical deliberation, practical thinking, is that it is about the particular. So that cannot be the same set of propositions, because Aristotle is not talking about particulars. Indeed, he says, I have to talk in this way, because I don't know the particulars.
Right.
Yet we want to say something general. And I would think philosophical, something general, something theoretical.
So in the end, the gap.
Well, so I really think that this teleological reading of the distinction is important.
Right.
Because what would be the use of a treatise that would be essentially about particulars? That would be story. It wouldn't be philosophy. So I like that. Encourage you to
Okay, go on.
go all the way.
No, I think it's one thing that it's difficult to see is that even adopting this reading, one possible difficulty is this: you have to create a scenario in which all those propositions that are theoretical in this wider sense, not such a technical, ontological way of considering it, but they have these other characteristics, and they're not dealing with particulars. But you only can bridge the gap when you have the insights of call it whatever, of the individual agent in the particular circumstance, right?
Which is what it says all the time.
Yeah, all the time. So the picture would be, it's not clear for me what is the connection. You have to offer both the idea that this individual can be the virtuous individual that he is independently of anything you're doing, right? On the one hand, you have to presuppose this. It does not have to read the ethics or know those things in this way, at least, right?
Yes.
But you have to offer, this has to be, I used once this expression, morally cogent for him, not only something that, okay, interesting, now I know also that there's this explanation in a second order. This has to be binding in practice for this individual once he grasps one of this information, right? So the pitch would be something like this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a difficult question because it really is the background of that consideration that you're advancing this question. Who is supposed to be the reader of this?
Right.
And I don't think that this is the guy who thinks, oh, shall I be just or not?
Right, no, of course
what
not.
the heck should I do?
No.
It's not for those people, I think. I think it's for coming, I mean, that's my personal opinion. I think it's for people who are going to legislate city states.
Right, I see.
And they need to have criteria that allow them to install the right norms,
Right.
which must fit the particular people that they are going to govern over and so on. And well, maybe it can also be helpful for an individual to, change her character or something, but I don't think that that's the purpose.
Okay.
But that's obviously up for grabs. But it doesn't seem to me that this is anything that is trying to persuade us to accept moral norms or to analyze moral norms. It's not really that much focused on moral norms at all.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So there's still the problem that we have two kinds. We have an actual practical deliberation, and we have what is going on in the ethics, which we suppose we agree that this is kind of general, kind of theoretical. Then how do these two go together? But there is this view. That's a view that is accepted by all the people who we quoted here, which I think is wrong. That's the view that the form of practical deliberation is the practical syllogism. Okay, I think that is only incidentally sometimes true. Most of the time it's not. So that's one thing. What would be the form of that kind of reasoning? There are, you might think that the ethics, the argument of Aristotle's ethics is a kind of practical deliberation. People say that. I forgot who says this openly, but you say this openly, that all of this follows the logic of a practical deliberation, where we have a goal, we are trying to figure out how to reach that goal.
No, but I don't think
it's also.
I don't think it's the case.
Yeah, no, that would be interesting because Aristotle doesn't tell us, and now we are done with this declaration, now we should act or something, now we should decide to become will. But that is a question that needs to be addressed. How does practical deliberation actually relate to the argument of ethics?
No, thank you. I'm completely agree with what you said. Except one thing, I would grab every suggestion, but try to resist the idea that it's directed to legislators. I will try to offer a broader. Yeah, of course, but it's a minor point. It's just that.
It's directed to his students.
Yeah,
but they are going to be 90% of them are going to be legislators in this.
Probably, maybe, but it would be enough to say that he's not talking to someone that he's just asking someone that fits the description he offers in 1, 3, and 4, right? So it cannot be someone who lives catapathos. It cannot be someone who doesn't know how to grasp the hoti. It has to have been well brought up. So the final pitch would be something like, well, if you don't know that this is a good action to start with, I can't offer you any sort of explanation why and what is involved in knowing why this is a good action. Yeah, yeah.
Let's say something about this. With Klaus' suggestion, the agatory in line stranger base, it's not simply to become someone good in a very general sense, but you have the best exemplars of human beings. This is because these people already are good people. They know what they have to do, right? They know that they should not kill people. Still,
The student, the hearer of this language.
Yeah.
This is what I was trying to. My impression is that all the first half of your interventions were much more nuanced than anything I could possibly have think about. In the sense that they were opening the reading for me. Okay. Right, but now you were strictly. So this is my intuition is to resist this, but a minha intuição é resistir. Desculpe, mas seria.
I just try to pursue this line of thought.
Sim.
Zagatori should be already good. So Aristotle is not saying, "Oh, I have raw material here, and by reading, listening to me, reading to my work, these people will become good." No, I have people already educated. They have good habits, and now with this, they will know exactly what's the operation, how character is built up, etc.
Right.
So I'm not convinced of this too. This is
a very interesting point. I never used this idea of hinagathoi phenomena here in this sense you were proposing. I stumbled with this idea that you were describing in other passages, right? So when both 1.3 and 1.4, but also when he tries to explain in what sense you learn to be good by doing good things. Then in those circumstances, I can see what it is to, well, in one sense, these individuals are already doing just acts, prudential acts, courageous acts, or something like that, but not exactly in the way and with all the features that will define them as virtuous. Okay, and the same applies to the establishing the conditions for the hearers, the audience, right? So they have to know the hoti, although they don't know the hoti. So this is a very loose description. Say, oh, if you're Josima, because I will not discuss with you. So something like that, right? I will not discuss with the moralist or something like that. I will just engage with people who already know at least that these actions are good actions. So you can redescribe this in terms of, well, they are good in this way, but in order for them to become good, you have to have these two senses also here, right? So would you accept this? The two senses here, right?
Yes, but this agatoire is much better.
Yes.
People who goes to Aristotle school already being good.
Right.
They're become agatoire.
Right.
By this lesson.
Yeah.
That's why these lessons are beneficial to them.
Right.
But Klaus had.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about the agatoire. I think it's collective. It's just so that people become good, and that includes us. Because
it's a weaker. This is what I would prefer, a weaker version, right? So more general, right? But it's a good point for them.
But chapter 2 is, I think, very important for your argument. I mean, if you go further down line 5, well, since the catalogos is of such a kind that it is very hard to say anything general about it, this is even more the case for the logos of the particular. That even less possesses the exactitude. And it seems to me that, and then he says, for that, the Hecaston logos, there is no technique for it, there is no general science for it, there is not even a manual instructions. You really have to figure it out for yourself in each case. And I think that this implies that what Aristotle does to the ethics is a catalog.
Right. So one thing that I always thought about in relation to this question is that the immediate lines after the definition of the daimonia, Aristotle says that this is just a perigraphein of the this is just, right? But we have to fill in an paragraph, we need to fill in the details, right? But at the end of book 10, it says the same thing. I always try to connect this with this notion of generality, catalogically in this sense, not empty, not logismos, not syllogismos, logikos, not a dialectical or whatever you want to take that expression to mean, but in terms of being general in this sort of sense you are presenting here in this passage and connected with book one and then. The problem is this, right? There has to be some evolvement, some development throughout the book.
But there is. You have Monida is activity of a rational part according to virtue, and you have a whole series of consisting in the definition of particular virtues. So this is fill out the perigraphe.
Right. Why I do say that this is just a sketch, just Jose Pitopoulos does just at the end. My suggestion, what I am trying to say is, look, since we agreed that the only one who can actually fill in the details is the individual moral agent in the practical circumstance, etc., it's not doable to fill in all the details. This is all that I can do is go up to this stage. Now, the only person who can make this next step is the individual in the practical circumstance, right? Not minutes later, not this is different from right.
You're much more specific if you know what courage is.
Right.
And so on and so on.
Right.
And also the other views. I mean, like Charles, you haven't really pointed out just how ambitious Charles' view is. Charles thinks, I mean, he has a price to pay for this interpretation, which is that there is a special kind of thinking that is metaphysically, by definition, desirable. Now, that is something that Aristotle nowhere says, and really a very high price to pay. What he does is he's trying to get his thesis of natural evolving forms. He's trying to apply this to practical domain. And in the case of our friends Lawrence, Ben, you have the idea of two kinds of running.
And one of them is irrelevant.
One of them is irrelevant. And you really wouldn't know why you should know what virtue is in the first place. Indeed, I think that for them, I mean, they have these examples,
right?
And these examples they do without principles that are different shoes. And they say that this is empiricist. And to be an empiricist in the analytical sense of the term is to be someone who denies the reality of non-observable.
Non-observable, yeah.
And a goal, an Aristotelian goal, would be a non-observable. So it follows on their conception that the phronimos, not the philosophical phronimos, but the phronimos who is not any worse than the philosopher, doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know why it's good, what he's doing. But Aristotle says in the Anima, in Ethics 2, 3, that you, in order to act out of virtue, you have to act, you have to do what's good. You have to do it knowingly and out of decision, and you have to do it because it's good.
This is where I think they try to resist this objection by introducing the idea that, of course, he knows what he's doing, but not deriving from some definition or some principle. This is how they operate, right? Which is something that I reject, as I mentioned. I think it doesn't work.
But why would, no, I agree. Why does it work? So if you don't know, so how do you know that it's good? To pay back what you owe or something like that. Why would that be good?
Lived experience, just that.
But no, that is not knowing why it's good.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much. Really, really helpful.
There's
Claro.
uma vai running about the context T5, then 2, 3, 5, 2, 5, 3. Doesn't not clear to me why you have chosen these texts exactly, because there are texts I can see why in a way. There are texts which are sort of is authentic to say something about the TSTO like that.
Yeah.
But then why you have selected exactly this text and not the definition?
The definition of
Because you have seen anything particular.
No, this is minor mistake. I should have picked up better. It was just to offer one example apart from definitions, such as the one offered in the eudaimonia case, first block of the texts, and to say that there are other non-definition, I mean, not strictly speaking definitions, but are definitional in character in terms of explaining something such as, well, these are these three possibilities. It's not neither of these two, so this is the one. It's not exactly a definition, but it states something about the thing, something like second stage, right? Something like this. So to see that all those three stages of the scientific model are operating, but this is second level. But it's not, it would be better to have obviously the definition of virtue is state, etc. etc.
Okay, so more complete account.
Yeah, more complete. No. My special reason was just this, to show that even for the second stage, not the real definition, the final definition, when you are obtaining properties that are necessary, etc., it works. So thank you, obrigado. Desculpe o aborrecimento. Obrigado mesmo. Valeu.
Nós voltamos às 2 horas aqui, de outra sala, vamos